Our topic today is eating disorders. Eating disorders is unique within psychopathology because it's somewhere on the border between mental and physical. So on the one hand, it's a psychological problem, but on the other hand, it involves the body for sure, and it also causes death, which is also something quite unique within psychopathologies, that we have 5% death of people with eating disorders, with anorexia. And as I said, it involves physical and mental issues. So it includes a reduction in body weight between 25 to 50%. It includes the use of purging, laxatives, and so on, and a lot of physical activity in women, which is the population most hurt by eating disorders. We can see the cessation of menstruation, skin loss in the elbows, sensitivity to cold, so all sorts of physical issues that come with significant emotional issues, and 5% of people with anorexia will die of liver or heart dysfunction, so it's quite lethal. The typical behaviors for anorexia, for eating disorders, include preoccupation with food, so it involves crushing it, cutting it, chewing it, organizing on the plate, doing all these things for a lot of time. It's a lot of like hide and seek. It's sort of there, but it isn't. You see a lot of preoccupation with food. The food is on the plate, but then again, no one's eating it, or you prepare it for other people, not for yourself. On the one hand, these girls can, I'm saying girls because we're talking about a 9-to-1 ratio, that we have about 9 to 10 girls for each boy with anorexia. So these girls would be on the one hand wearing tights, or on the other hand wearing clothes that are baggy and big so that their body will not be seen. A lot of obsession with the way one looks, obsession with weight, obsession with exercise, and so on. All these are characteristic of eating disorders, and anorexia in particular. So people with anorexia can use all sorts of ways to purge themselves. They can throw up, they can use laxatives, they can use enemas, they can use all sorts of ways. We do have binge eating disorder in DSM-5 that is different from bulimia and anorexia, that involves only binging without actually purging oneself. But we're talking about anorexia and bulimia. We're talking about purging. We're talking about a mood disorder, so it involves a lot of the time some sort of low euphoria or irritability or indifference. It's a very lonely kind of disorder. So these girls, a lot of the time, they find themselves very lonely. They retreat. They do not have friends or family around them because of the way they behave, not because people don't want to support them, but then they reject them and want to be alone. They don't want people to see them. They don't want people to see them eat. So a lot of the time, it's a lot of inactivity during the day, a lot of sleeping, and then a lot of preoccupation. Once you get up, you're preoccupied with when you're going to eat, what you're going to do, how much exercise you're going to get in, and so on. There is this question about eating disorders, whether it has some sort of psychotic component. So when we do cognitive testing and we ask people to sort of show us how big they are, which of these photos resemble you the most, and so on, then there is quite a big distortion. So these girls would get it wrong by about 20%. So they would say they're 20% thicker. They'll say that the photo, that if you give them many photos that are photoshopped, they will choose a photo that is about 20% thicker than they actually are, and so on. So there's definitely a distorted body image in eating disorders. That's not controversial. That's absolutely unanimous. But the question is it sort of like psychosis? Is it something that is similar to schizophrenia that is more controversial. Most people would not say that this is a psychotic disorder. So anorexia has a very strong cultural component. So for one thing, anorexia had never existed in the past. It's only been around since World War II. And still, to this day, it does not exist in certain places in the world. There's no anorexia in Africa, for example. China has only jumped on the bandwagon lately. So for many years, there haven't been any cases of anorexia in China. So there's a very, very big cultural component to it. And that means that certain populations are at specific risk because they sort of fit the profile for anorexia. And that involves usually athletes, professional dancers, models, any profession that demands a lean body. And in general, one can say, you know, girls and adolescents, because of this preoccupation, because of the way that girls are told all the time that they need to be thin, that they need to be sexy, that they need to be a sex object, and unfortunately, we can say that girls buy into this stereotype, and they want to be thin, and they will do a lot to get that. So we are a society preoccupied with body image, and one of its manifestations is eating disorders, which is a relatively new phenomenon. Only in the last 60 to 70 years do we see eating disorders. So let's watch a little news item about girls in France, so models in France. It's about a law that was legislated there regarding the use of extra thin models. So I think this clip really shows one of the potential problems with the beauty model that is sold to us. Women watch, everyone watches these models on the screen all the time, and they want to be like them, which is quite, you know, difficult because not everyone is built with the same metabolism. Not everyone is built with the same body structure. And that really encourages girls to do very extreme things, to reach a low body weight. And so this is the reason for this legislation.
Fashion has always been fickle, but for models, it can be a matter of life and death. There's so much pressure to be skinny, it can lead to eating disorders like anorexia. A French model made it her mission to raise awareness about it, and after she died, Italy, Spain, and Israel all acted, banning undernourished, super skinny models from the catwalk. Now France has passed a tough new law too. As Mike Armstrong reports, breaking it could land designers in jail.
With this show of hands, a country that is a heavy hitter in the fashion industry is going after underweight fashion models. France's new law would keep modeling agencies and fashion houses from using extremely skinny models. Anyone employing a model with a body mass index of less than 18 could face fines equivalent to about $100,000 Canadian or even jail time, up to 6 months behind bars. The French health minister calls the legislation a message about nutrition to models, but also to young girls and women in general. The idea is to keep ultra-thin models from being held up as a beauty ideal, something to strive for. Other countries have made similar moves: Spain, Italy, Israel. In the words of one photographer, the difference between skinny and too skinny can be life or death. For French model Isabelle Carrot, it did mean death. Carrot was part of an anti-anorexia campaign in 2007. She died at just 28 years old. The new French law would force models to undergo periodic medical exams to ensure they're healthy. Olivier Véran is the French lawmaker who's been pushing the new rules.
Les mannequins sont en état de dénutrition.
He says models would be judged under internationally recognized medical standards. If they're deemed to be malnourished, they wouldn't be able to work in France. Now, there has been a public backlash against some fashion houses using ultra-thin models. When Stella McCartney used this model online for this year's summer collection and commented, "worn well," The online blowback was immediate. McCartney replaced the photo with another model and apologized. Canadian groups that fight anorexia are applauding France's move.
I think we need to really start to reframe what beauty actually means, and France is certainly taking a move in the right direction.
There has been some opposition from the fashion industry. France's National Union of Modeling Agencies is criticizing the law as lumping together anorexia and thinness. It also fears it could make what is an important industry for the country less competitive internationally. Mike Armstrong, Global News, Montreal.
So when we talk about the psychosocial explanations for eating disorders, we're talking about a combination of family stories and social perceptions. So we do know the profile that is usually associated with anorexia. These are beautiful, smart, middle-class girls for the most part, and they are part of it is the social story, that they are part of this pressure that they need to be very, very thin. Sometimes we see a lot of cases where girls, they want to be models, but they weigh, I don't know, too much. They weigh 100 pounds. That's too much to be a model. So you need to lose more weight. And so they start going on extreme diets, and then it's a slippery slope to anorexia. And there's the family story as well, so that a lot of the time we see with these girls that they have an overbearing mother, very intrusive mother that wants them to succeed and so on, and then their rebellion is through the body. And the rebellion is in two avenues, one can say. So one avenue is to say, you cannot control me, you can control a lot of things, you cannot control what goes in my mouth. And the other one is that I will not be like you, I will not be a woman. One of the arguments about anorexia is that it causes the girl to stay a girl, not to become a woman. So not to have the curvy body, not to menstruate. So it prevents a lot of things. So in that sense, it is a rebellion. The daughter rebels against the mother through her body, and there's still a large gap between women and men. The way that men are required to look is not as strict as it is with women. They are not measured to the same extent by their attractiveness in our society, and that's why we see much less of that of eating disorders in men, although it does exist. I was even an intern in a psychiatric hospital when a boy with anorexia actually died. He weighed 26 kilograms when he died. It was very, very sad. So that happens, but it's very rare. So it's about a 1-to-10 ratio between boys and girls. And we also have to remember that it's not totally a misconception to think that being skinny, being pretty is a recipe for success. We have actually quite a lot of research showing that people who are prettier, thinner, they will succeed more in all sorts of situations like job interviews, and they will get more help when they ask for it, let's say on the street or on the road. If they need help, they'll get more help if they're pretty, if they're thinner. So, and we see what's going on in the past 2 decades, I would say, with all these reality shows. You know, people are totally preoccupied with a group of morons on an island as long as they look good. So, so definitely the issue of physical looks is very, very important in our society. So this is about a news item that I showed before about France. Let's talk a bit about prevalence. So the prevalence is constantly rising. For example, this research shows that in 2000, there were 288 youth with eating disorders in Israel. In 2008, we're talking about almost 1,000. In 2008, we had 228 children and teens hospitalized for eating disorders. And we see 200 patients die every year of anorexia. So these are very, very high numbers. And 81 of those hospitalized were 10 to 14, and 147 were 15 to 18 years of age, with an average age of 40 and a half. So this is very, very pertinent to, very relevant to adolescents and for teachers who teach adolescents. Another unique thing about Israel is the military service. So, and we see a connection between eating disorders and military service. So when a study was done a few days after recruitment, 12 to 21% of soldiers had some sort of anorexia symptoms, and 8 to 19% had partial bulimia. So we're talking about very, very high numbers here. Also, another study that was done in Israel shows that women in Israel really value the sort of behaviors that anorexic women exhibit. So they really feel that, you know, trying to be thin and doing everything to be thin is something that will help you in life, help you get friends, a job, help you become more popular. And this was true for younger women and for older women, especially for younger women, but actually also for older women. So this is a very strong factor within our society. And in general, a lot of the time, the reaction when you hear about people with anorexia is admiration. So people say, wow, how can they do it? How can they live on an apple a day? I've been trying to diet for so many years and I haven't been successful. So, and also within psychiatric hospitals, they are the most popular, the smartest, the best looking, and so people look up to them. And then you see a lot of other people also imitating their behavior. So people who come for depression or schizophrenia actually develop eating disorders because they want to become like them. But again, it's not only in psychiatric disorders, it's everywhere. People really value these sort of behaviors. So there's a very ambivalent message socially about eating disorders. A big question about anorexia is hospitalization. So do we force people to be in a hospital because they have an eating disorder? The main argument is that this way we preserve life, we prevent deterioration, and then, you know, we can work with it and change eating behaviors and allow for weight gain. And but on the other hand, there is the issue of a person's right to his body, a person's right to her autonomy, and so this has to be done with consent, and it's a very, very delicate issue. A lot of the time, people go into the hospital willingly, they hospitalize themselves, they start working on it, then they start to gain weight, then they get scared. Oh no, I gained weight. Who knows how more I will gain? And then they ask to be released, and then a lot of the time they need to their request needs to be requested because they have this basic human right for autonomy. So this is very, very difficult. In a psychiatric hospital, they would receive personal therapy, they would receive family therapy, they would receive a diet regime. Also, a lot of the times, one has to admit, as someone who has been to psychiatric hospitals, it's a cat and mouse game. So a lot of the time, the staff wants them to eat more, they want to eat less, they play all sorts of games with the staff, trying not to eat. It's a very, very complicated treatment. Now, this is a French model. Her name was Marie. She passed away. I think it was on the news item at the age of 28. And she agreed to be part of a campaign against anorexia, and part of it is also the campaign against the websites that encourage anorexia. Very famously, it's pro-Ana and pro-Mia. So that's pro-Ana is pro-anorexia, pro-Mia is pro-bulimia. And these are girls that sort of encourage one another. You know, you can do it. You know, give me a high five, girls. I managed to live off lettuce today, and so on. And so they encourage one another. And this was part of a very controversial campaign because it's so shocking to see this girl part of a very controversial campaign against anorexia and against these websites as well. Now, bulimia is also something that's been on a rise since the 70s. And what we see there is binge eating. So they will take a lot of calories at one time, eat a lot all together, and then purge themselves using whatever laxatives or usually throwing up. That's the usual way. And of course, we have the usual things, you know, the excessive preoccupation with body appearance, a lot of exercise, and so on. So bulimia can be diagnosed once you have at least 2 binge eating episodes per week for 3 months. It's very common, and it's becoming more and more frequent since it's been discovered or invented or whatever you want to call it in the 70s. So it keeps going up. 90% of the cases are women. The peak incidence is 15 to 30-year-old, but I have met women with bulimia at the age of 60 and so on. So they just continue to do it. It becomes a way of life, and it's very difficult. And we're talking about a prevalence that ranges between 2 to 10%, and there's a lot of comorbidity. So you have anorexia and bulimia at the same time. They look different. So people with anorexia are usually skinnier. People with bulimia function better. They function socially and so on. The binge eating, we're talking about 2,000 to 10,000 calories in less than 2 hours. So it's usually done in a secret sort of way. They buy the food and eat it alone usually, and it ends with purging. Sometimes there are rituals, so you have to do it in a certain way. And there's a lot of comorbidity with depression, with impulse control disorders like sexual permissiveness, gambling, alcoholism, drugs, and so on. But again, I've met very, very well-functioning people who are bulimic, so they work in, you know, very lucrative professions, and they function, they have families, but they purge and binge eat a lot. As I said, there's all this hierarchy within eating disorders. So anorexic, they are considered those who really were able to achieve it all the way. So they're usually much skinnier and less functioning, and you know, they've gone all the way with that. And people with bulimia are sort of considered within this milieu as they didn't quite do it. They weren't there. They're not, usually their body weight is fine. It's not very, very skinny, and they function much better. They're part of society. They did not go all the way. It's not good for you. So you can look at all these symptoms that I wrote here. It's really not good for you. It can rupture the stomach, cause ulcers, cause heart rate disturbances. It can cause uncontrolled nausea and purging. It can cause all sorts of mood swings. You see mothers with bulimia are at higher risk for all sorts of health problems. So it's really not good for you. When we look at the profile of people with bulimia, it's a bit different than the profile of people with anorexia. There's much more of a propensity for perfectionism, drive for achievement, and rigid self-criticism. When we talk about the family, again, we see this overbearing mother, the intrusive parents, but we see lower family cohesion, high incidence of divorce and marital difficulties, a lot of difficulty in expressing emotions and warmth and dependence. And within the families, there's also a higher prevalence of depression, alcoholism, and sexual abuse. The bulimia is usually chronic with periods of remission and relapse, so spontaneous recovery is not common. A lot of the time, it's talked about like they talk about addiction. So like you're addicted to a drug, you're addicted to this way of life, you're addicted to the purging, you want the results that have to do with your weight. And when we look at it in the long run, we see that about 40 to 50% are partially or fully recovered. But there are quite a significant portion that have a chronic kind of condition that they remain with for many, many years. What are the factors that sort of predict better prognosis? So when the onset of the disorder is later, then it's worse prognosis. When it's a combination of purging and the use of laxatives, then it's also a worse prognosis. When we have bulimia and anorexia together, and when there's a history of eating disorders in the family, then we see a worse prognosis. Overall, this is not a mortal disease. So it's not like anorexia where we see 5% mortality. Here, usually people do not die from bulimia.